Hey GenderqueerChat, it's Matt, it's Thursday, and this week's topic was suggested by a viewer. It is to do with being genderqueer and also looking at transitioning. And I think the actual question says being transgender and genderqueer, but I think from what some of the others have talked about, we've maybe narrowed it down to meaning having the identity of genderqueer, experiencing that and feeling that way about yourself, but also looking at some kind of process of physical, social, physical, social or hormonal transition from one gender to the other or at some place between. And if those two concepts are compatible. So like Christina said in their video, which I just watched, I wholeheartedly agree with the idea of the term transgender being like an umbrella term. So I think it's a very broad banner that encompasses a variety of different gender identities other than just strictly male or female. So everything from genderqueer to transsexual, everything else. many different kind of gender identities other than just strictly male or female in that kind of conventional way that we see gender. So that's how I view transgender. And from that perspective, I identify as a transgender person. I came across the term transgender first and identified that way. I find that genderqueer is a much better fit, but for me it doesn't rule out also identifying as transgender. So to me, transgender is the umbrella term for the experience in the sort of greater awareness of society. Genderqueer is my personal identity, and they kind of interplay and work in together quite well. It's also possible for a genderqueer person not to identify as transgender, and that's perfectly valid. Transgender is, an idea, even as a banner, that comes preloaded with a lot of misconceptions and a lot of sort of societal ideas, and I think that's something that should be probably talked about as in terms of answering this question, in the sense that actually transitioning from one gender to the other or pursuing that sort of path for whatever reasons is not the whole experience of transgender. In fact, being a transsexual person who is generally more inclined to be looking at that process of transitioning from birth sex to desired gender or the gender that they are is a really small part of the whole transgender experience. It doesn't encompass everyone's experience. It's not indicative of what every transgender person would be. In fact, I would imagine it's quite a small select chunk of that people who reside under that banner. But I think transgender and transsexual do get mixed up quite a lot. They're used interchangeably in society, and I think if you say transgender, a person's mind doesn't wander and think, oh, genderqueers and non-binary people and gender fluidity, people who identify as multiple genders or neither genders or whatever. I think people think transgender, they think person born male wanting to be female, or person born female wanting to be male, and surgery to physically modify their body in order to get to that desired destination. So I think there's a huge misconception there. But I don't think that the concepts are mutually exclusive. I think it's possible for somebody to identify as transgender and genderqueer, like myself. I think it's possible for somebody to identify as transsexual and genderqueer, although I think that would be slightly more unlikely. But that's only just from the perspective of why somebody would choose to identify as genderqueer and gravitate towards that particular term and concept and idea and community, as opposed to somebody who would identify as a transsexual. Now, I went through a stage where I thought maybe I was transsexual, and that's more from the perspective that because there was a limited amount of information that I'd come across, and once again that societal cultural perception that that's what transgender is. You're born in the wrong body, you must need to transition, that must be the solution. In the early stages of sort of coming to terms with my identity, I didn't understand there was such a thing as genderqueer. I didn't know it was okay to exist outside of the binary, or not identify as strictly male or female, or not wanted to desire to transition from one to the other. So I never really identified that way, but it was kind of it was a step on my personal journey that I came across that term. But obviously the other terms were a different fit. I think for somebody to identify as genderqueer, most likely they are identifying somewhere off the male and female spectrum altogether. Not to say that a genderqueer person can't identify as male or identify as female, whether that's to do with their the sex they were born or the gender that they know themselves to be. That's perfectly reasonable and rational. There have been many examples of people currently and previously on the channel who are that way. But I think for someone to identify as genderqueer, maybe there's that awareness that that's not all there is, that a person doesn't strictly, wholly and solely fit in the female box or the male box, that there's room to move, that there's a spectrum or an awareness of a greater array of sort of experiences or expressions of gender. And you know, that's where that blurring of the lines come. So whereas a person who's transsexual, for them to commit to that, identify that way, and to want to go through a process of medically, physically, socially, hormonally transitioning, which is an expensive, dangerous, socially very difficult experience, I would imagine. If somebody's using that identity term for themselves, most likely their experience is one where they, you know, have a real strong desire to change their physicality and identify socially as the other gender that they're not currently perceived to be. So yeah, for a genderqueer person though, transition is an option, whether that's, you know, physically and wholly to, you know, change one's body and hormonal makeup to that of what they weren't born as, or to position themselves differently in society so that they're viewed as the opposite gender. But I also think there's a lot of room for people to do that in different ways. It may be that a person might opt to have some physical transformations, or, you know, some degree of hormone therapy, or choose to socially transition but not physically transition, or the other way around, or maybe change themselves just enough so that they feel comfortable at a certain point on the mythical gender spectrum that that's in line with how they feel about themselves and their identity. So that is perfectly valid and reasonable, and I don't think that at all in any way hinders, you know, or means that somebody can't identify as genderqueer. In fact, I think that's kind of, you know, the experience. But like all the people on the channel and the people who have been on previously, that experience is going to be unique and different for everybody, and everyone's going to desire different things based on how they feel about themselves, how they feel about their gender, how they feel about their body, whether or not they experience things like dysphoria, how they integrate or, you know, misfit with society, or their experiences through life and what they desire and where they want to be, how they view themselves. So it's going to be different. Me personally, I am not going through any process of physical transformation, and from my perspective I don't do that because I don't have a burning, really strong sense of physical dysphoria, the body dysphoria. I don't have that, but also I don't know what I would need to do to get to where I need to go, or where I need to go, what that actually looks like. I know that deep down I really desire having a female body, a female experience, a female life. I feel that that's a better fit for me, but it's not what I've got, and I know there's no way of getting that with, you know, without some kind of magic trick. Like it's not. I'm not interested in having a transsexual experience or being a genderqueer person who partially transitions. Like, I'm kind of okay enough. Sorry, I hope that doesn't sound bad. I'm okay enough with me as I am, and that's a process of, you know, coming to terms with that as well. But I'm okay-ish enough with me as I am that I can be in this body with this hormonal makeup and everything else, and, you know, feel confident and comfortable within my genderqueer identity. But that's not the case for everyone, and it also may change over time for people. So yeah, that was a long-winded way of saying that it's perfectly fine for somebody to identify as genderqueer and also identify as any other label under the transgender banner, or as transgender, or even transsexual, I guess, or to desire changing their body or taking hormones or transitioning socially. You know, it's perfectly valid, and I think genderqueer itself is also a umbrella term. There's no one way to be genderqueer. There's no one way to experience that, and there's not one way to express that. And I think one of the great things about coming across identity label like genderqueer and transgender is that it gives you that flexibility to identify as you and just be who you are. And if that involves, surgeries, not having surgeries, if it involves hormones or not hormones, changing your name, dressing in any particular gendered form of clothing or being whatever you need to be in society, then so be it. We just do what we need to do. And for some people, that's the transitioning stuff as well as identifying as genderqueer. So I hope that was helpful. It was a bit wordy. I lost the track of what I was saying, but thank you for listening, and thanks for suggesting the question, and see you next week.